So we're here with our friend and colleague Nick Walker to talk about a number of issues pertaining to autism. Nick, thanks for being part of this series.
Thank you.
Nick, could you just briefly describe who you are and bit your background?
Sure. So my name is Nick Walker, and I'm an autistic author, speaker, activist, and scholar. I teach at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco and Sophia University in Palo Alto. And I am a martial artist. I'm an Aikido teacher. I've taught the martial art of Aikido for about 35 years or more now. And I'm also a co-founder and editor for Autonomous Press, which is a recently founded publishing house that's owned and operated entirely by disabled workers.
Nick, just for the clarity of people listening, very often in the field of intellectual disability and the general public, people usually think you have to say people with autism. And yet you talk about yourself as an autistic scholar. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that's identity language, but our viewers may be a bit confused. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, I always use identity first language, talking about autism as most autistic activists and scholars do now. So autistic person or just autistic, not person with autism, because the autism is not something that is separate from us any more than our gender or ethnicity is separate. I'm not a person with maleness or a person with heterosexuality, so I'm not a person with autism. If anything, I mean, I could change my gender much more easily than I could stop being autistic. So it is integral to who I am, and it's a very important linguistic distinction to use the identity first language, autistic person and not person with autism, because person with autism, that person first language has a history. That particular language is intimately entwined with the abuse of autistic children, that autistic children have been abused and poisoned with quack biomedical so-called autism cures or treated with abusive behaviorist therapies by people trying to remove their autism. So the whole idea that the autism is a with, that it's something that can be separated from the person, has a history of creating abusive situations for autistic children. So that's why it's very important to recognize that autistic people are integral, that autism is integral to who autistic people are and can't be separated and can't be removed, because attempts to remove it have always been abusive.
Now, the first area I'd like to look at is the divergence between autistic adults, scholars, and activists, how they describe autism, and I guess the most famous clinical researcher, Simon Baron-Cohen, who put forward his definition of autism. Could you talk about that divergence of views on what autism actually is?
Well, of course, autistic people are speaking from the experience of actually being autistic. So there's a whole industry of professionals, so-called professionals, this whole industry of researchers and scholars and psychologists and other professionals who are not autistic and who have built their careers around talking about autistic people without knowing autism from the inside. And so they have a vested interest in maintaining their appearance as experts, and that means shutting out the real experts who are the autistic people. And That's a shift. There's a shift happening because more and more autistic people are outspoken activists, scholars, writers, speakers who can speak about their own experience, but not just our own experience, but can also speak about autism from a scholarly perspective and from a research perspective.
So what are some of those specific views that are A, wrong, and B, harmful?
Well, of course, Baron Cohen is most known for his claim that autistic people have lack empathy or lack something called theory of mind. Baron Cohen didn't come up with this. It was Uta Frith, and if you listen to what Uta Frith has to say about autistic people, it's hateful. She's really a genuine contempt for autistic people and their humanity in what she says, and she really believes that we're less than human and lacking some key component of what it means to be human, and can't build real human relationships. And so Simon Baron-Cohen has, I think, become more well known, and much of what he says sounds a little more compassionate on the surface, but it's still based on this idea that autistic people are lacking this so-called theory of mind or lacking in empathy. And he's been very dismissive of autistic people who've refuted his views, who've said this doesn't match my experience, or say, well, this is the giant hole in your research method or in how you've interpreted the research. And he has not addressed the actual issues. He has not addressed when someone points out a hole in his logic or his reasoning or his research methods. Instead, what he does is he ignores it, or he will say, well, you just don't understand because you're autistic.
For people who don't have an understanding of theory of mind, can you give a colloquial description of Baron Cohen's idea?
They started out saying, well, autistic people just they lack empathy, and they lack this thing called theory of mind, which is the ability to understand what's going on in other people's minds, the ability originally what they were saying was that even the ability to recognize that other people have subjective experience and that there is anything going on in other people's minds. And then to some degree or another, they've stuck with this idea that autistic people can't understand what other people are thinking. This was all based on some very faulty research. This test supposedly for theory of mind called the Sally Ann test, where they set up a scenario. They present autistic children with a scenario about two girls playing together, and they were supposed to figure out what one girl is thinking or what one girl is or isn't aware of in the story. The story and the question are fairly complex, and of course, development of language and language comprehension is often slow in autistic people because they're navigating a very complex sensory and cognitive experience, and so their development of certain kinds of comprehension, especially when it comes to following the story and answering questions in a strange and stimulating environment, like a research study, their ability is going to be developing slower than that of non-autistic children. And so it turns out that if you adjust for language, that autistic kids do just as well on this test as non-autistic kids. If you adjust for the language issues, and this is, similar mistakes have been made with deaf children, that, they were dismissed as being less intelligent back in the old days, until they started developing intelligence tests that weren't based on hearing and spoken language comprehension. So the research methods were flawed in the first place because they weren't adjusted for language comprehension. So they're actually showing slower development of certain kinds of language, which we already knew about autism, and not actually a failure to have theory of mind or to empathize. The original claim then was this lack of theory of mind, which is a debatable concept. What is this theory of mind thing? Of course, we know that other people have minds and have consciousness, but lack theory of mind and thus lack the ability to empathize. And then there's a huge amount of research that came out in firsthand testimonials from empathy experts like Harlan McLaren, or neuroscientists and autistic people themselves, and parents of autistic children who were seeing how empathic their children could be. There's a lot of people saying, oh wait, these people are quite empathic. In fact, overwhelmingly empathic, sometimes overwhelmingly tuned to what's going on with other people emotionally. And in the face of all of that, eventually Baron Cohen has backpedaled and said, oh, well, there's two kinds of empathy. There's affective empathy, which is picking up on emotional states. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is like theory of mind, which is figuring out what other people are thinking. So now the claim is, well, autistic people do have affective empathy, but they lack cognitive empathy. They have impaired cognitive empathy. There's a great little bit of backpedaling and retrenching. But of course, that's garbage, because when you look at how cognitive empathy works, what's happening when you figure? I mean, is it really empathy to figure out what someone else is thinking? That's figuring out. That's not empathy. That's poker. But that figuring out, it seems obvious that it's easier to figure out what someone is thinking and feeling if their thought process is more like your own. Right. So, of course, autistic people have difficulty figuring out non-autistic people. Non-autistic people also have difficulty figuring out autistic people. But nobody says that non-autistic people have impaired empathy for not being able to understand autistic people. And of course, you get people from two drastically different cultures or backgrounds, and they'll have trouble figuring out, what is this person thinking? What does their body language mean? Autistic body language, and how autistic people think, and what's going on in their minds. It makes perfect sense to me as an autistic person. We understand each other just fine. But it's just like cross-cultural communication. There's a large body of work on cross-cultural communication, and if you get a room of white Americans and then Chinese people, born and raised, spent their whole life in China, and you put them together and they have trouble understanding each other because of the cultural divide, well, of course, you'd be laughed out of academia if you said it was because white Americans lack empathy, or if it was because Chinese people lack empathy. It's recognized, oh, there's a cultural divide, and there's challenges to cross-cultural communication. So what's called for here, I think, to replace very biased ableist theories like Baron Cohen's, these theories that say the disabled minority are the defective ones, and the abled majority, we don't have a problem if we can't understand them. What's needed to replace that is a concept of cross-neurotype competence, cross-neurological competence that works the same way as cross-cultural competence. Autistic people, of course, are forced to develop some degree of cross-neurotype competence. We have to learn to understand non-autistic people, or they will institutionalize us, abuse us, and kill us. Non-autistic people including academics and researchers like Simon Baron-Cohen, continue to grossly misunderstand autistic people because they can get away with not having to learn. And I'm very fond of quoting Carl Deutsch, who was a 20th century political scientist, has a great quote that power is the ability not to have to learn. And I think that's what we're looking at here with the whole so-called lack of theory of mind or lack of cognitive empathy, and all of that is just when there's a misunderstanding between autistic people and non-autistic people, and non-autistic people hold the social power, and therefore they can blame it all on the autistic person. It's all the autistic person's deficit that we can't understand each other. Non-autistic people don't even have to recognize, they have the luxury and the privilege of not even having to recognize what they're not understanding.